It was the 1950s, and Europe was still emerging from the devastation of the Second World War, with the Soviet Union feeling the effects of the aftermath more than most. However, although they came out of the war bruised and battered, they were adamant that they were matching the technological advancements of the West, notably in aviation. To demonstrate that they could hold their own against the capitalists, this is the story of how the Russians built their first commercial jet airliner in record time, and how it was, for 2 years, the only passenger jet in the world, along with being the first jet airliner to cross the Atlantic. However, it is also a story of shortcuts, artificial deadlines, sloppy engineering with an almost complete disregard for safety, creating one of the most dangerous Soviet passenger aircraft in history, claiming over 1,000 lives. In the 1950s, the British de Havilland Comet was the shining star in civil aviation. Its origins trace back to a visionary project initiated in 1943, when a committee led by the aviation pioneer and former Member of Parliament John Moore Brabazon convened to explore the post-war possibilities of revitalizing the British air transport industry. By 1945, de Havilland was awarded the contract to develop and produce Britain's first civil jet airliner under the designation Type 106. However, because the type was so advanced, de Havilland had to undertake a mammoth task of designing and developing the airframe and engines. Even though de Havilland began design studies in 1946, it took a few years before the first flight of the Comet jet airliner took place on the 27th of July 1949, and then went on to enter service with the BOAC in 1952. It seemed that Britain had stolen a march on everyone. The Americans were amazed, and of course the Soviets were stunned. The Comet flew almost twice as fast as most piston airliners, cruising at 42,000 feet, and flew twice as high as the DC-6. It seemed that the mild-mannered, tea-drinking Brits had opened Pandora's box, and everyone wanted in. It's essential to keep in mind that the British had been planning the Comet since 1943, and it took them nearly 10 years to go from concept to commercial service. Even so, the Comet's design had a lot of issues, and after a series of fatal crashes, the whole fleet was grounded. Yet, the Comet's performance proved to the world that jets were the future. So if the Americans and Russians were going to play catch-up, they'd better pull their fingers out and get a move on. At the time, Aeroflot, the flag carrier and state-owned airline of the Soviet Union, was still flying antiquated, cramped Lisunov Li-2s, which were license-built DC-3s, and the noisy, uneconomical Ilyushin IL-12s. In contrast, various airlines in America were flying the Douglas DC-6, Boeing 377, and the magnificent Lockheed L-1049 Super Constellation. In a country the size of the Soviet Union, the existing propeller-driven aeroplanes took forever by today's standards to get from Stalingrad, now St. Petersburg, to Vladivostok, with multiple fuel stops along the way, all the time flying in weather due to not being able to climb high enough from lack of pressurization. You can imagine the vibration from the propeller engines, and the noise would have been a test of endurance on journeys which may have taken 4 days. So, the Soviets wanted a fast, high-flying, jet-powered civilian aircraft. What they wanted was their own homegrown Kometovsky. With their own passenger jet, they could cut flight times across their territories by huge margins and bring the people of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics into the jet age. I hope you're enjoying this video as much as I've enjoyed making it. If you are, please take a moment to hit the like button to feed the YouTube algorithm. A small gesture like that helps the channel grow and reach more people. And perhaps consider subscribing for more aviation content. Now, back to the video. But where to start? By the time the Comet was in service, jet-powered bombers had been around for a few years. The Americans had the 4-engine B-47 Stratojet in service, and the Soviets had their new twin-jet Tu-16 strategic bomber, codenamed Badger. It seemed logical to the Tupolev Design Bureau that they could shortcut a majority of the research and development by taking the Tu-16, which they had just finished, and borrow its wings, engines, and tail surfaces, and adding them to a wider, pressurized fuselage designed to accommodate 50 passengers, thus creating the Soviet Union's first jet airliner, which they named the Tu-104. Similar to the Comet design, Tupolev positioned the two Michelin AM3 turbojet engines of the Tu-104 inside redesigned nacelles at the wing roots and lowered the wings on the body. Looking at the Tu-16 and the Tu-104 side by side, the main difference is that on the Tu-104, the wings are placed lower on the fuselage. Other than that, the two aircraft are reasonably similar. Bearing the engines in the wing roots is probably the worst place to put them, since access for maintenance is difficult. Also, more engine vibration is felt in the cabin and the aircraft as a whole. That's also about the worst place I can think to have an engine fire. There's a reason they don't make them like that anymore. Also, Tupolev correctly guessed that the Comet losses were due to structural failure caused by metal fatigue. For this reason, he deliberately made the Tu-104 beefier than the British jet. Most notably, he designed it with round windows instead of square windows, which caused the structural failures that led to the loss of the Comets. As a side note, the Tu-16 bomber was such a success that it was in service for almost 70 years, of which they produced around 1,500 of the type in various versions, and the Chinese license-built version, Shan H-6, is still the primary bomber aircraft for the People's Liberation Army Air Force. The Tu-104 made her maiden flight on June 17, 1955. During flight testing, the aeroplane's performance was found to be comparable, if not exceeding, that of the Comet. She had a maximum speed of 590 miles an hour, with a cruise of around 500, whereas range was more or less the same as the Comet at around 2,700 kilometers, depending on loadout, which was still not bad. Still, it was not a long-range airliner. It's noteworthy that the Tu-104 and the Comet shared similar ranges and speeds, even though the Tu-104 was equipped with only 2 engines compared to the Comet's 4. Despite the thirstiness of the two Michelin AM3 turbojet engines, a trait shared by many Soviet-built airliners, they never lacked power. Each of the Michelins produced an impressive 21,400 pounds of force, in stark contrast to the 5,000 pounds generated by each of the Ghost 50 jets in the Comet. Well, they certainly needed the power. Take a look at the undercarriage of the Tu-104. For a 50-seat airliner, she had the main gear of a much larger aircraft that she had to carry around to contend with pretty crude runways, and she needed a sturdy set of legs considering she weighed almost as much empty at 44,000 kilograms as the Comet's maximum takeoff weight of 50,000. On the 15th of September 1956, the Tu-104 began revenue service on Aeroflot's Moscow-Omsk-Irkutsk route, replacing the Ilyushin IL-14. Immediately, the flight times were cut almost in half, from 13 hours to just 7. Also, the new jet dramatically increased passenger comfort as they traveled in relative luxury in a pressurized cabin arranged in a 2+3 with a central aisle that supported air conditioning, and with cabin noise-reducing measures, making it one of the quietest airliners of its time. However, the Tu-104 was regarded with some amusement and curiosity by the West for its luxury interior, including seats and fittings made from mahogany, copper, and lace. A case of sour grapes, perhaps. In the air, pilots reported that the Tu-104 was challenging to fly, with the manually actuated flight controls being heavy. But the real fun came when landing. One drawback to using the wings directly from a military bomber was their 36-degree sweep, which resulted in approaches being flown relatively fast at around 180 miles an hour. And to slow down on landing, the pilots had to deploy 2 drag chutes to prevent them from plowing into fields off the end of the runway, as many Russians and indeed international runways at the time were too short to safely accommodate a landing jet airliner, especially one based on a bomber. An unused feature of the Tu-104 is its distinctive glass nose. Contrary to what many in the West speculated back then, this feature was not designed for the aircraft's conversion into a bomber. Given the vast expanse of the Soviet Union, with large stretches of sparsely populated areas and limited radio navigation aids, visual navigation remained a significant part of Russian flying practices well into the 1960s. The glass nose had served a practical purpose, providing the navigator with a clear view to reference visible landmarks during their journeys. In 1956, The same year Aeroflot started flying the Tu-104 on commercial routes, CSA, the Czechoslovak national airline, bought 6 Tu-104s from Tupolev, which they used on routes from Prague airport to Brussels, Moscow, Paris, and so on. CSA helped cement the Tu-104's legacy by becoming the first airline to operate a route exclusively with a jet airliner on their flights from Prague to Moscow. The Tu-104 was used to carry VIPs, including Soviet leaders, as well as regular passengers. Since the Comet had been grounded after multiple crashes, it was the only jet airliner in commercial service between 1956 and 1958. However, the French Caravelle and Boeing 707 were in their flight testing stage, and the DC-8 had yet to make a maiden flight. The Soviet government did not waste any time promoting the aircraft as a symbol of the country's technological prowess, and it was featured prominently in Soviet propaganda. To rub the West's nose in the superiority of Soviet aviation, they flew a Tu-104 to London and America. The arrival of the Tu-104 in London during a 1956 state visit by Nikita Khrushchev surprised Western observers at the time, who thought that the Soviets lacked the advanced technology required to build a commercial airliner with such performance. Even though the Soviets tried to pass off the Tu-104 as a ground-up original design, it was clear to all that the Tu-104 was the Tu-16 bomber with a pressurized fuselage. However, this did not stop Khrushchev, who ordered 3 Tu-4s to be flown to the British capital. Although it's debatable if this was done as a proof of mass production, or because of the poor reliability of the aircraft, had his people worried about a mechanical malfunction embarrassing the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, in 1957, the Tu-104 was the first civilian jet to make a transatlantic flight when it flew from Moscow to New York via London, Iceland, and Canada. Even though it was not carrying fare-paying passengers, it was another obvious demonstration by the Soviets of their growing superiority in civil aviation. Designing complex jet airliners based on government deadlines and demands is a catastrophe waiting to happen. It is often said that many regulatory policies and safety initiatives are driven by tragic events, with many regulations written in blood. The Tu-104 was not an exception. The rush to get her into service for the sake of national pride would result in deep-seated flaws that would only come to light once she entered service. It was a bitter irony that the Soviets got what they wanted when they said that they wanted their own Comet. Even though the Tupolev designers may have learned from the errors of the Comet, they were still navigating uncharted territory. During the flight, the Tu-104 was reported to be very unstable, with poor control response and an inclination to Dutch roll, rolling in one direction and yawing in the other. When the pilots complained about the plane's characteristics, the designers at Tupolev Bureau refused to accept that there was something wrong with their design, with Tupolev himself going as far as accusing the pilots of unprofessionalism and not knowing how to fly his aircraft correctly, despite the pilots having had flying experience with the Tu-16 bomber. The Tu-104 was also very vulnerable to stalling due to the poor aerodynamic of the wings, resulting in a propensity for the stall to come on with little or no warning in turbulent weather. Not only that, but she also had a dangerous tendency to pitch up violently before stalling and entering an irrecoverable dive, which forced the pilots to maintain a dangerously high approach speed to avoid stalling into the ground on finals. It was these flaws that would be responsible for 2 fatal crashes in 1958, which almost ended the entire program, were it not for the actions of one heroic pilot. Tragedy struck the Tu-104 for the first time on August 15, 1958, during Aeroflot Flight 04 from Kharabovsk to Moscow. The ill-fated flight unfolded in the midst of challenging weather conditions, with clouds towering over 30,000 feet. The Tu-104's pilots attempted to outclimb the weather to avoid the turbulent clouds, only to encounter equally formidable cumulus clouds even at that altitude. Subsequent investigations uncovered a critical detail. Climbing to such heights, considering the aircraft's weight at the time, was deemed unsafe. This maneuver could only be attempted in calm weather and lightly loaded planes. The dangerous combination of excessive altitude and updrafts within the clouds triggered a stall, disrupting airflow into the engine intakes and causing them to flame out. The cascading issues, engine failure, extended landing gear, crew disorientation exacerbated by the malfunctioning artificial horizons, rendered recovery nearly impossible. The aircraft impacted the ground at a 60-degree angle, having a sprawling 1,480-foot wide debris field. Every soul on board, all 64 individuals, tragically lost their lives in the crash. However, at that moment, the cause of the incident remained shrouded in mystery. It would take another fatal crash a couple of months later for the pieces of this tragic puzzle to come together. On the 17th of October 1958, the second fatal crash involving a Tu-104A, registration CCCP 42362, similar to the incident a few months earlier, occurred when the aircraft entered an area of high turbulence. The plane, which had only recently ended service 3 months earlier, with just 465 flight hours, was caught in a potent updraft and experienced a sudden and significant increase in pitch, causing it to climb to 39,000 feet. One of the pilots radioed that the aircraft was standing on its hind legs. Shortly after, it initiated a sharp near-vertical dive, followed by a spin. Despite the crew's best efforts, the force of the aircraft's horizontal stabilizers proved too great for the pilots to counteract. The pilot in command, Harold Kuznetsov, realized that they had little hope of recovery and directed the radio operator to transmit details about the dire situation to ground controls. According to the recordings, he concluded with his heartbreaking last words, "We're dying. Goodbye." The aircraft crashed near the town of Kanash, Russia, 400 miles east of Moscow, killing all 80 people on board. These incidents revealed that under certain atmospheric conditions, both in clear weather and near thunderstorms, the Tu-104 was susceptible to losing longitudinal stability, potentially resulting from landing gear dropping, engine failure, and artificial horizon failure. In response to these crashes, authorities imposed a maximum flight level of 29,500 feet for the Tu-104. Tupolev initiated a redesign of the aircraft's stabilizers, and the plane's center of gravity moved. Had it not been for Harold Kuznetsov's presence of mind and professionalism during the final moments of his life, the Tu-104 may have suffered the same fate as the Comet the Soviet government had so desperately wanted to emulate. However, despite these modifications and restrictions, the aircraft would, between 1958 and 1981, be involved in another 35 incidents. In total, 16 were lost in crashes out of 37 jets written off, which amounted to an incredibly high hull loss rate of 18%. However, it would be unfair not to mention that an errant missile shot down one, and 3 Tu-104s were lost due to hijackings. Nevertheless, Aeroflot finally retired its entire fleet after another crash on the 17th of March 1979, when an overloaded 104 with mismatched engine parts caused a false fire alarm to sound shortly after takeoff, forcing the pilots to return to the airport. In poor visibility, the plane descended below the glide slope, where the wings struck a power line pylon, contracted to the top of a small hill, and became airborne again. The Tu-104 barely crossed the Moscow-Kiev highway and crashed into a field, having lost wings and the cockpit. The fuselage slid on the ground and stopped 1.5 kilometers from the runway threshold, killing 58 of the 119 people on board. But the Tu-104 was not yet done. After Aeroflot had retired their fleet, several aircraft were transferred to the Soviet military, which used them as staff transports. On the 17th of February 1981, a Tu-104A carrying many of the Pacific Fleet's senior officers from Leningrad crashed during takeoff from Pushkin Airport, killing 50 people, including 28 of the high-ranking Soviet military personnel. The accident investigation revealed that the crew allowed the aircraft to be improperly loaded. Evidence was uncovered that led to investigators to believe that some military officers did not comply with seating assignments given by the crew, and that these officers pressured the crew to make the flight in an unsafely loaded aircraft. Another factor reported by witnesses was that large rolls of printing paper were loaded on board, and these are believed to have rolled rearward during acceleration during takeoff, causing the center of gravity to shift all of acceptable limits, thereby reducing the stability of the aircraft in pitch, making lowering the nose impossible for the crew. Regardless, the cause of the crash, the type was finally and permanently removed from service. The last flight of the Tu-104 was a ferry flight from Ulyanovsk Airport Museum on the 11th of November 1986. Tupolev's ongoing development efforts resulted in various airframe versions, marked by increased passenger capacity, extended range, and upgraded engines. A total of 22 modification projects were undertaken, alongside additional projects that never came to fruition. Notably, the Tu-104A airframe was transformed to accommodate 115 passengers. This was achieved by reducing seat pitch and adding seat rows, leading to the designation Tu-104V. However, production of the Tu-104 ceased in 1960 in favor of safer and more efficient airlines. Although in 1960 the Tu-124 was developed from the Tu-104, this was a smaller, more compact version to serve Aeroflot's requirement for a short-range regional jet to replace their Ilyushin IL-14 on domestic routes. Resembling a 75% scaled-down Tu-104, the two were hard to tell apart at a distance, but it was not a complete copy of the 104. This version could seat 44 passengers. The Tu-124 had several refinements, including double-slotted flaps, a larger center section air brake, and automatic spoilers. It also had better power plants. It was the first airliner installed with the Solev D20P low-bypass turbofan engines, now commonplace for civilian planes today. Among the Tu-104 versions, the Tu-104AK, a flying laboratory, emerged as a successful project. This unique aircraft was designed explicitly for cosmonaut training and could perform zooming climbs and descents to simulate artificial zero gravity for up to 25 seconds. In 1964, a Tu-104AK carried a one-to-one mock-up of an airlock, which A.A. Lisunov used to practice for his historic spacewalk. The Tu-104AK was used for cosmonaut training until the IL-76, which incidentally is available for tourists to take a ride on. In no way was it perfect. The Soviets showed the West that they could build a passenger jet aircraft. This was the first stepping stone for the Soviet commercial jet aviation, as many more jet-powered aircraft followed the Tu-104. Tupolev designed the successful Tu-134 twin-engine narrow-body jet airliner, which flew in 1963 and served in 42 countries until 1989. But it was the Tu-104 that changed air travel in the Soviet Union, as the jet took passengers' comfort to the next level. However, the enduring legacy of the Tu-104 is that it has the worst accident rate of any Cold War Soviet-era passenger plane. It was so bad that a song was written about it, and in the 1950s, the Boeing 707, Douglas DC-8, and Sud Caravel appeared, completely overshadowing the Soviet pioneer.